Content warning. This content may be unsuitable for viewers under 18 years of age and those sensitive to fear, horror, or disturbing content. If you are under 18 or are sensitive to frightening material, please do not watch or read further. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. What if I told you that the scariest moments of your life don't happen in dreams? They happen when your eyes are wide open, when you're completely aware, when you know, bone deep, gut-wrenching, undeniably, that what you're experiencing is real. No alarm clock to save you. No ceiling fan to stare at while your heart rate drops. Just you, your body, and whatever is standing on the other side of that door. These are not campfire stories. These are not urban legends passed down by teenagers trying to impress each other. Every account you're about to read happened to real people, ordinary Americans, students, missionaries, teenagers home alone on a Friday night who crossed paths with something they still can't fully explain. Some of them describe it as paranormal. Some blame circumstance. Some don't describe it at all anymore. They've stopped talking about it. You'll understand why. 5 stories, 5 moments where normal life split open and something dark crawled through the crack. Read them in order if you want the full effect. Read them with the lights on. Read them and then ask yourself, what would you have done? Because the truth is, most of us would have done exactly what these people did. And that's the most terrifying part of all. The house on Eldridge Lane. There's a house at the end of Eldridge Lane in our old neighborhood in Dayton, Ohio, that nobody would go near. I mean nobody, not the teenagers who spray-painted everything else in the area, not the older kids who claimed they weren't scared of anything, not even the mail carrier, who I once watched visibly speed up while passing by it on his route. But my older brother Connor wanted in. I was 10 years old. He was 12. We shared the upstairs of our parents' 2-story colonial, and that September, Connor had become completely obsessed with the abandoned house 3 blocks over. He'd done his research, and by research I mean he'd spent 2 weeks gathering rumors from every kid on our block. According to neighborhood legend, a family had lived there in the early 1980s, then one day just vanished. No foreclosure notice, no moving truck. They left their furniture, their dishes, their photo albums. The power company had cut the utilities years ago, but people swore they still saw light flickering in the upper windows after midnight. The house had been sitting there ever since, peeling white paint, broken shutters hanging at wrong angles, a massive oak tree out front that had grown through the porch railing like it was consuming the structure piece by piece. Every window on the 2nd floor had at least one cracked pane, and the front yard had gone completely wild. Knee-high grass and tangled blackberry bushes that nobody ever trimmed. Connor had a plan. On a Wednesday night in mid-September, he came into my room after our parents had said goodnight and stood in my doorway with 2 hand-crank flashlights and the look on his face that meant he'd already decided and was only asking me as a courtesy. "You coming?" he said. "Here's the thing about being 10 and having a 12-year-old brother who thinks he's completely fearless. You go. You don't want to. Your stomach is already doing flips, and every rational cell in your body is screaming that this is a terrible idea. But you go, because the alternative is staying home alone. And that's somehow worse." We went out through his bedroom window, 1st floor, easy drop, and walked down the block with our flashlights, cranking them every few seconds to keep the light going. Those hand-cranked flashlights were loud. Every squeeze produced this mechanical whirring sound that cut through the quiet suburban night like a saw blade, and I kept thinking someone would hear us and call our parents. But the neighborhood was dead silent. Not even a dog barking. Not even a television glow from a window. We got to the house in under 5 minutes. The back fence was falling down, so we just stepped over it into the yard. The back door was locked. I felt a full-body wave of relief when Connor tested the handle, and it didn't budge. I started to say something about heading home. Some reasonable excuse about it. Being late, but before I could get the words out, Connor was already walking across the overgrown yard toward the back of the house, scanning the ground for something. He found a 2x4 plank half buried in the weeds. I watched him lift it, test its weight, and turn toward the back window with an expression of total calm. Then he started smashing the glass. It didn't take long. The window was already cracked in several places, and after 3 or 4 solid strikes, the remaining glass fell inward. Connor used the plank to clear the jagged edges from the frame, then reached in, found the latch, and slid the window up. He looked back at me. "Come in." We climbed inside. The first thing I noticed was the heat. It was a mild September evening, mid-70s outside. That perfect late summer temperature where you don't need a jacket, but you're glad you left the heavy one at home. Inside the house, it felt like August in a car with the windows rolled up. The air was thick and stale, and it had a smell I couldn't quite name. Not rotting wood, not mold exactly. Something older and stranger than either. My shirt was sticking to my back within 30 seconds. The second thing I noticed was how intact everything was. I'd expected a ransacked disaster zone. Spray paint on the walls, garbage on the floor, maybe some broken furniture. Every abandoned building I'd seen in movies looked like a war zone. This place was different. The furniture was still arranged like a family had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. A couch with floral upholstery. A dining table with 4 chairs pushed in. A bookshelf with actual books still on it. No graffiti anywhere. No evidence that anyone had been inside in years. We were the first. Connor was already moving toward the staircase, cranking his flashlight with rhythmic determination. I followed close behind, my own light making that same terrible whirring sound. We climbed from the back entryway up to the main floor and stood in the living room, both of us sweeping our lights across the space. That's when we heard it. A single creak from the floor directly above us. Not a settling house sound, not the random pop of old wood adjusting to temperature. A creak. Deliberate. Weighted. The kind that comes from something moving. I grabbed Connor's arm. He pulled it away. "It's an old house," he whispered. "Houses make sounds." I stopped cranking my flashlight. The light immediately began to fade. I reached over and tried to stop Connor from cranking his too, thinking, I don't know what I was thinking, that whatever was upstairs couldn't find us if we were quiet and dark. Connor looked at me like I'd suggested we both stand on our heads and called me stupid in a low, irritated whisper. Another creak from above us. Then one more, slightly to the left. Something was moving up there. Connor started toward the stairs. I want to be clear about what happened next, because I've been asked to describe it many times over the years, and I always tell it the same way. I did not want to go up those stairs. I was not brave. I was not curious. I was 10 years old and I was completely terrified, and my legs carried me up after my brother anyway, because standing alone on that main floor in the dark was not something my body was willing to do. At the top of the stairs was a hallway with 3 doors. 2 were standing open, bedrooms from what we could tell in the glow of our flashlights. The 3rd was closed. It was directly above where we'd been standing when we heard the creaking. I begged Connor not to open it. I pulled on his sleeve. I told him I'd never come anywhere with him again, ever, if he opened that door. He shook me off gently, still wearing that infuriating expression of calm, and reached for the doorknob. Then he stopped. His hand was inches from the knob, and he went completely still. In the dim light, I could see him turning his head slowly, tilting it toward the door, his ear almost touching the painted wood. Silence. 15 seconds of it. 20. The kind of silence that's so complete it starts to sound like something itself. A low, pressurized hum at the edges of your hearing. Then the door exploded. Not opened. Exploded. A single massive bang from inside the room. A strike against the door so powerful the whole frame rattled, and Connor flew backward across the hallway and hit the opposite wall hard enough to knock a frame picture loose. He crashed down, holding the side of his head where it had struck the wall, and I was already gone. I don't remember making the decision to run. I don't remember the stairs. I don't remember the window we'd climbed through. The next thing I have any clear memory of is standing in the backyard, gasping, and Connor appearing beside me a second later, and both of us running, actually running, back down Eldridge Lane toward home. We were so loud when we came back in through the window that our parents woke up. They stood in the hallway in their robes asking what had happened, and we told them. Every bit of it. They listened with the expressionless patience of adults who have heard too many ghost stories and grounded us both for a week. But here's the part I've never been able to explain. The part that still, decades later, makes me hesitate before I walk down a dark hallway. 2 nights after we got home, I woke up at roughly 2 in the morning to a sound outside my window. A mechanical sound, rhythmic and familiar. A sound I'd been hearing all night in what I'd assumed was a dream. The whirring of a hand-crank flashlight. I sat up in bed. The sound was right outside. Through my slightly open blind, there was a wash of pale light moving in a slow arc, the uneven, fading glow of a dying hand-powered beam, like someone was cranking it slowly, letting the light dim, then cranking again, back and forth, patient. I stood up. I crossed to the window. My hand was on the blind. The cranking stopped. I pulled the blind aside and looked out. Nothing. Complete darkness. Not the ambient dark of a lit neighborhood, but a total swallowing blackness, like someone had cut the power to the entire block. No streetlights, no porch lights. Nothing. I stood at that window for a long time. I don't know if I imagined it. I don't know if the week of bad sleep and hyperactive imagination had finally produced an auditory hallucination realistic enough to wake me from a dead sleep. I don't know. And that's exactly the problem. Because the certainty I felt in that moment, the bone-cold, stomach-dropping certainty that something was standing outside my window with our flashlight, is not something I've ever been able to fully dismiss. I hope it was a dream. I'm still not sure. The third stall. This one happened during my freshman year at Hargrove University in upstate New York, one of the oldest private universities in the Northeast, founded in 1847, with a campus that looks exactly like you'd imagine a 100 to 77-year-old institution of learning to look. Stone buildings, ivy, arched doorways that were already ancient when your great-grandparents were young. It's the kind of place that accumulates stories the way old wood accumulates moisture, slowly, thoroughly, until the stories are just part of the structure. The campus is divided into 4 main academic buildings, each corresponding to a different cluster of disciplines. The Arts and Humanities Building, Whitfield Hall, is the oldest of the 4, dating to the university's founding. It's the one that sits slightly apart from the other 3, connected by a covered walkway that always seems to be catching wind from the wrong direction, regardless of the weather. Whitfield is also, according to every student, every janitor, and apparently several members of the administration, the one you don't want to be in after dark. My design history class met in Whitfield Hall, 3rd floor, room 314. Late afternoon on Tuesdays and Thursdays 4 to 5:30. On a Thursday in October, about 6 weeks into the semester, my friend Danny needed to use the restroom with about 20 minutes left in class. She leaned over and asked if I'd come with her. We'd only been friends for a few weeks at that point, but had already established the kind of easy shorthand that happens fast in college, and I said sure, glad for any excuse to rest my eyes from the projector's glare. The women's restroom was at the end of the 3rd floor corridor, maybe 40 feet from our classroom. Danny went in. I waited outside, leaning against the corridor wall, listening to the building settle and creak around me. Whitfield made a lot of noise. Old buildings do. And after about 2 minutes, I decided she was going to be a while and walked back to class without telling her. She came back maybe 7 minutes later. She didn't walk in. She burst in, fast, hard, the door swinging open and her scanning the room immediately for me, and when she found me, her face was doing something I'd never seen it do before. It wasn't quite fear. It was more like the expression a person makes when they've seen something they're still in the process of convincing themselves they didn't see. She sat down next to me and didn't say anything for the rest of class. Afterward, walking back to the dorm, she told me what had happened. She'd been in the stall when she heard one of the sink faucets turn on. She hadn't heard anyone else come in, no door opening, no footsteps. But the water was running, clearly and steadily. She assumed it was me, maybe coming back in after having stepped out. She called my name. No answer. She called again. Nothing. She finished up and came out of her stall. The restroom was empty. No one at the sinks. But the faucet was still running, and the stall directly next to hers, the 3rd one from the door, was locked from the inside. Danny isn't a dramatic person. She doesn't exaggerate. She stood there for a moment, faucet running, stall locked, and tried to be rational about it. Someone must be in there, she thought, sitting very quietly. She bent down to look under the partition. No feet, no shoes, no legs, nothing on the floor of that stool at all. But she could hear something. A voice, or voices, she wasn't sure. Soft and feminine, like whispering set to a tune. Humming almost. Coming from inside a stall that, by any visible evidence, contained no one. She left without saying another word. We sat on that story for a few days before we worked up the nerve to ask one of the regular Whitfield janitors about the 3rd floor bathroom. I'd seen him there often enough that I recognized his face. An older guy named Mr. Kellerman who'd been at Hargrove for over 2 decades. He didn't seem surprised by the question. He told us, without much ceremony, like he was explaining which supply closet held the extra mop heads, that the 3rd floor women's restroom in Whitfield had been a known location on campus for as long as he could remember. Staff members had a long-standing informal policy. Nobody should be in that bathroom unaccompanied after 5 in the evening. When I asked why, he paused for a moment like he was deciding how much to say. Then he said, there had, over the years, been a number of reports of a woman in that bathroom. Not a student, not a faculty member. A presence. Concentrated specifically around the 3rd stall. He didn't use the word ghost. He just said a presence, and let the word sit there. He'd seen things himself, he added, but didn't get into detail. I want to be careful here about how I frame this. I'm not telling you that Danny's restroom is haunted. I'm not telling you that the ghost of a woman has been living in a bathroom stall at Hargrove University since before any of us were born. What I'm telling you is that my friend went into a bathroom and came out looking like that, and that when I asked the person who'd worked in that building for 20+ years, he confirmed without hesitation that the place has a history. What you do with that is your business. What I did with it was start using the restroom in the building across the parking lot, and I kept doing that for the remaining 3.5 years of my college career. The Yakuza apartment. This one is different from the others. There's nothing supernatural about it. There are no unexplained sounds or locked stalls or flashlights cranking themselves in the dark. What makes this story terrifying is that every single element of it is grounded in the completely mundane, real-world fact that some people will kill you for knowing what they don't want you to know. I was 22 years old, serving a 2-year mission for my church in Japan. My last assignment was in Osaka, a dense, complicated, extraordinarily alive city that I'd wanted to visit my entire life. I had maybe 6 weeks left before my return flight to Salt Lake City, and I was starting to feel the specific, bittersweet weight of a chapter ending. My mission companion was a guy named Elder Bradshaw from Phoenix, Arizona. We'd been paired for about 3 months and had developed the kind of efficient teamwork that comes from spending literally every waking hour together. We knocked on a lot of doors. Most people weren't interested. Some were. You develop a rhythm for it. On a Tuesday night in November, Bradshaw and I were working a residential block in a part of Osaka that sat several economic brackets below the areas we usually covered. The buildings were crowded close together, the alleys between them barely wide enough to walk single file. And the one we decided to try was the kind of structure that makes you appreciate everything you've ever taken for granted about your living situation. Narrow stairwells, peeling numbers on the doors, a smell in the shared hallway that I won't describe in detail. We knocked on the second-floor unit on the left. The man who answered was somewhere in his 40s, wearing a worn-out white undershirt and sweatpants, and he had the specific look of someone who had been awake for too long and thought about the wrong things for too long. He smiled at us, but the smile was slightly off, too wide, held a beat past where a genuine smile would stop. We introduced ourselves. We explained what we were there for. He nodded along without really listening, and then, before we had finished our opening, he stepped back and waved us inside. In missionary work, that's usually a good sign. People who invite you in are interested, or at least curious. I stepped through the door, and within 2 seconds I understood that this situation was different in every way that mattered. The apartment was tiny. A narrow entryway, a bathroom door on the left, a miniature kitchen to the right, and a single main room containing a low table, a television, and a sleeping mat. The smell hit me immediately. Marijuana and something else underneath it. Chemical and sharp. Every surface was either covered in bottles or in items I won't describe here. The man closed the door behind us and gestured to the floor cushions on either side of the low table. We sat down. He sat across from us and immediately began talking. Not about our church, not about the pamphlet Bradshaw was holding, but about Christians, about how much he hated them, about what he thought they deserved. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't being subtle. He stated it with the flat certainty of someone describing a fact about weather. Bradshaw and I exchanged a look across the table. The man was deeply, thoroughly drunk. By the time we'd been sitting there 10 minutes, he'd refilled his glass 3 times from a bottle of whiskey on the floor beside him. He kept talking, circling back to his hatred, then veering off into other topics, then coming back. He seemed to have forgotten what we'd told him we were, which was the only thing working in our favor. Then he stopped mid-sentence, looked at both of us with sudden focused attention, and said he wanted to tell us a secret. He said, "You can't tell anyone." He got up from the table. He went to the corner of the room and dragged a metal box out from beneath the sleeping mat. He placed it on the table between us, unlatched the lid, and opened it. I've thought carefully about how to describe what was inside, and the most accurate description is this. More money than I had ever seen in one place in my life. Stacked, bound, densely packed Japanese yen in denominations that added up. By Bradshaw's later estimate, he was better at the conversion math than I was, to somewhere between 40 and 60,000 American dollars. Maybe more. The man watched our faces, then he told us where it came from. He worked with the Yakuza. He named the specific organization with a casualness that made my stomach drop. The way you feel when a car swerves toward you and misses. The danger coming clear only after it's passed. He described his role in enough detail that what he was telling us was unambiguous. He was not a low-level associate. He was not peripheral. I watched Bradshaw's hands go completely still on the table. Here is the specific thought I had at that moment, and I remember it with perfect clarity because it arrived with the cold, clarifying force of actual fear. This man doesn't know who we are. The moment he remembers that he just told 2 American Christian missionaries about his criminal organization and showed them his money, we are going to be in genuine danger. He was drunk enough that he hadn't made the connection yet. He was still talking about the Yakuza, about money, about things I will not detail here, and every sentence he spoke was another second of borrowed time. Bradshaw, to his credit, stayed completely calm. We had spent months developing the ability to have a pleasant, neutral expression, regardless of circumstances, and he deployed it now with everything he had. I followed his lead. We nodded. We didn't react to anything. We kept our hands on the table where they were visible. When the man paused for a refill, Bradshaw said quietly that we should probably get going, that we had other appointments that evening. He said it easily, conversationally, like we were wrapping up a pleasant visit with a cooperative potential convert. The man shook his head. He said we couldn't go yet. He wanted to keep talking. The next 15 minutes were the longest of my life to that point. He talked. We listened. We smiled at appropriate intervals, and we slowly, incrementally shifted our positions on the floor so that we were oriented toward the door. Eventually, Bradshaw stood up. I stood up with him. We said our goodbyes, formal, unhurried, the full polite exit ritual, and walked to the door. Behind us, I heard the man get up from the table. I heard him cross to the corner of the room. I heard something shifting, something heavy being moved, something opening. We didn't look back. The door, the hallway, the stairs, the street. We walked for 2 blocks before we let ourselves run, and then we ran for another 3. We never reported it. We talked about it for a long time afterward, me and Bradshaw, in the measured, careful way that you discuss something that frightened you so thoroughly, you're not entirely sure you processed it correctly. The consensus we eventually reached was simple. If that man had been sober, we would not have walked out of that apartment. Whatever he was reaching for in the corner, we will never know. I still don't want to know. The figure at the window. I want you to think for a moment about what it's like to be 15 and home alone at night. Your parents are out. The house is yours, which sounds great in theory and feels increasingly less great as the evening gets later and the rooms get darker, and every sound the house makes starts to seem like it requires investigation. I was 15. It was a Friday night in January. Parents out at a dinner party, expected back around midnight. Our house was a single-story ranch style in suburban Columbus, a long, low building with the bedrooms at one end and the living room at the other. My room sitting right where the bedroom hallway met the main living space. It was an odd layout. My bedroom door opened directly into the living room, which meant there was almost no separation between my private space and the main hub of the house. I had the door shut. I was playing video games on a television that sat on the dresser across from my bed, headset on, deep enough into whatever I was doing that I'd lost track of time. The living room behind my closed door was completely dark. At some point, maybe 10:30, I became aware of a sound. I pulled off the headset, knocking on glass, coming from the living room. I sat still for a moment, processing. Then I set down the controller, opened my door, and stepped into the dark living room. The front of the house faced the street, and there were 2 windows in the living room behind the low, decorative bushes my mom had planted along the foundation. I stood in the middle of the room, not moving, listening. Silence. I went to the front door and stepped outside. I walked along the front of the house to the bushes below the living room windows and looked around and behind them thoroughly. Nobody. Nothing. No footprints in the thin layer of January frost on the grass. I went back inside. I went back to my room. I sat down and picked up the controller. 5 seconds. Knock. Knock. On the window. I was back outside faster than I can describe, actually running out the front door and around to the bushes. But again, nothing. I stood there in the cold in my socks, breathing hard, scanning the front yard and the street. A car drove by. A porch light across the street was on. Everything looked exactly like a normal neighborhood on a normal Friday night. I went back in. I didn't go back to my room. I stood in the living room for a moment, door to the outside still unlocked, trying to decide what I was dealing with. Probably kids, I told myself. Stupid prank. Someone thought an empty-looking dark house made a good target. Probably already gone. I started back toward my room. Knock. I turned and went directly to the window. I didn't go outside first this time. I went straight to the glass and pressed close to it, looking out through the lower pane into the darkness beyond the bushes. And for a moment there was nothing but my own reflection staring back. Then I looked down. At the base of the window, on the inside edge where the wall met the floor, there was a shadow that didn't belong to anything in the room. It was the shadow of a person, sitting against the exterior wall, below the window, hidden by the bushes from the street. Something was sitting right there, on the other side of the glass from me, condensed into the shape of a person crouched low against the house. Low enough that I couldn't have seen them from outside. The shape perfectly clear in the light coming from the street behind me. I don't know how I got back to my room. I know I locked the door. I know I was under my bed with my phone before I'd consciously decided to move. I know my hands were shaking when I called my dad. The knocking continued while I waited. Even patient, unhurried, not frantic, not someone in trouble, not a prankster losing interest and escalating. Patient. Like whatever it was had nowhere else to be and was content to wait. I stayed under my bed. My dad called the police from his end. He stayed on the phone with me. He told me to stay in my room, door locked, wait for the officers. I did all of those things and counted the minutes. After a while, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, I had no reliable sense of time. The knocking stopped. The police arrived about 10 minutes after that. 2 officers walked the perimeter of the house with flashlights and came back with the same answer I'd gotten on my 2 barefoot trips outside. Nothing. No signs of entry. No signs of exit. Every exterior door locked. Every window shut. But here's what one of the officers said to me, and what I've turned over in my mind every time I think about that night. He said the foundation bushes along the front of the house showed signs of compression, like something had been resting against them. He said it looked fresh. They didn't find anyone. There was no incident report beyond a general wellness check. My parents came home, walked through the house, checked everything twice, and concluded that it was either a prank or my imagination. My dad's official position has been the latter ever since. I don't argue with him about it anymore. But I know what I saw at the bottom of that window. I know the shape of a person when I see it. And I know the difference between the shadow thrown by a piece of furniture or a coat hanging on a hook and the shadow of something that chose to be where it was. Whatever was outside my window that January night knew exactly what it was doing. I've lived in apartments since college. Ground floor windows stay covered. Darkness has a sound. Before I tell you this last story, I want to say something about fear. Real fear. The kind that these stories deal with. The kind that burrows into you and stays. Is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a soundtrack or a jump cut. Real fear is quiet. It arrives in the gap between one moment and the next, in the half second when your brain processes something it wasn't expecting and hasn't yet categorized. Real fear lives in that gap. I want you to remember that when you read what comes next, my name isn't important. And what matters is that I grew up in a small town in rural Tennessee, the youngest of 3 kids in a family that rented a farmhouse at the end of a long gravel road, 12 miles from the nearest town. There were no neighbors within visual distance. The nearest house was a half-mile away down a dirt road that flooded every spring. We were, by any reasonable standard, isolated. I was 17 when this happened. My parents had both gone to my oldest sister's college graduation weekend in Nashville, leaving me alone at the house with our dog, a 6-year-old border collie mix named Rutherford, who was the best behaved animal I've ever known, and who, on the first night my parents were gone, began behaving in a way I had never seen before and have never seen since. It started around 9 in the evening. Rutherford had been lying at my feet while I watched television, which was his typical Friday night position. He got up, walked to the back door, and stood there. Not asking to go out, he had a very specific behavior for that, a specific kind of restless pacing. This was different. He stood facing the door, completely still, and stared at it. I figured he'd heard something outside, a deer, a raccoon, something in the tree line. I told him to settle down. He didn't move. After a few minutes, he walked back to me, stood next to my leg, and put his head in my lap. This was not typical Rutherford behavior. He was an independent dog. He didn't ask for comfort. I turned the television off. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that a house 12 miles from town gets at 9 on a Friday night. Not peaceful quiet, just absolute absence of sound, the silence of a place that has nothing around it. I sat in that quiet and listened. Nothing. I told myself I was being affected by the atmosphere of being alone in an isolated house at night, which was true and unhelpful. I turned the television back on. Rutherford went back to his position at my feet. 20 minutes later, he was at the back door again. This time, he was making a sound I'd never heard from him before. Not barking, not whining. Something lower and more continuous coming from deep in his chest. A sound that a dog makes, I would later learn, when it detects a threat it cannot identify. Not prey. Not a familiar intruder. Something categorically outside its experience. I got up and turned on the back porch light. The porch was empty. Beyond the porch, the yard extended maybe 50 feet before hitting the tree line. A solid wall of old-growth Tennessee hardwood that had been there before the farmhouse and would be there long after. In the yellow pool of the porch light, the yard looked normal. Grass. The old tire swing hanging from the oak we'd put up when I was 8. The rusted burn barrel my dad used for yard debris. Nothing moving. Nothing out of place. I turned off the porch light. In the darkness that followed the light going off, I heard it. It was coming from the tree line. Distant, 40, 50 feet away, and low, and it was the most wrong sound I have ever heard in my life. I cannot describe it precisely because my brain has never found a category for it. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic. It was rhythmic in the way that breathing is rhythmic, in and out, but slower, and with something woven through it that I can only describe as intent. Like whatever was making that sound was making it deliberately. Like it was communicating something. Rutherford began to bark. Wild, continuous, frantic barking. Every alarm bell in his biology going off at once. I closed and locked the back door. I went through the house, locking every door and every window on the ground floor. I turned on every light I could reach. I ended up in the upstairs hallway with Rutherford pressed against my legs, both of us listening to the silence below. I called my parents. My mom answered. I told her what had happened, the dog's behavior, the sound from the tree line. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said in the measured, calm voice she uses when she's actually worried, that I should call the county sheriff's department. I did. The deputy who drove out was a large, unhurried man who'd been in the county all his life and had clearly heard a lot of things. He walked the perimeter of the house with a high-powered flashlight, checked the outbuildings, walked to the tree line, and came back. He sat in his truck and I sat on the tailgate, and he told me that he hadn't found anyone and hadn't found anything, but that there were signs in the soft ground near the tree line of something having stood there. Multiple depressions too large for deer, arranged in a pattern he couldn't account for. He offered to stay until I felt settled. I said I was fine. He left. I wasn't fine. I spent that night on the living room couch with every light in the house on and Rutherford lying across my feet. Somewhere around 3 a.m, he finally relaxed. His body went slack in the way that a dog's body goes slack when it decides the threat has passed, and I fell asleep a little after that. I don't know what was in the trees that night. I don't know what Rutherford heard and smelled and detected, with all of his senses working together in the way that animals' senses work when they are doing the thing they were built to do. I don't know what made that sound. I've offered myself explanations over the years. A bear, maybe. We had black bears in the area. An animal in distress. Someone on the road. The way sound travels over open ground at night can produce auditory illusions that feel inexplicable, but aren't. I've offered myself those explanations, and I believe about half of them. The other half I just carry. There's one more thing, a detail I've left until now because it's the part of the story I like least. When my parents got back on Sunday evening, my mom went to do a load of laundry and found the back door unlocked. I know I locked it. I stood at that door and turned the deadbolt and tested it. I'm certain of it. When I told her that, she said I'd probably just forgotten in the excitement. She was matter-of-fact about it, moving around the kitchen, starting dinner, the way she always is when she's decided that a thing is not worth worrying about. I didn't argue. But I stood in that kitchen and I thought about those 2 nights alone. The sounds from the tree line, Rutherford's behavior, the door I definitely locked. And I felt something settle into me that hasn't fully left since. The feeling that something had been close. Very close. And that it had been paying attention. What we carry, these 5 stories end here. But I don't think they ever really end for the people who lived them. The brother who heard the bang on the door is in his 40s now. He works a regular job in the suburbs. He doesn't talk about the house on Eldridge Lane unless someone asks, and even then he keeps the version short. But his younger sibling, the one who followed him up those stairs, still sleeps with a light on. Not a bright light. Just enough. The college freshman who waited outside the bathroom went on to finish her degree at Hargrove and graduate with honors. She took a job in Manhattan. She uses the bathroom at any hour she wants now, in buildings all over the world, and most of the time she doesn't think about it. The missionary who sat across a low table from a drunk Yakuza-connected drug lord lives in Arizona now with his wife and 2 children. He and Bradshaw still talk occasionally. They don't usually bring up Osaka, but sometimes when a conversation drifts into the territory of close calls, one of them will say, "Remember the apartment?" and the other one will say, "Yes." And that's usually where that part of the conversation ends. The teenager who saw the shadow at the base of his living room window graduated high school, went to Ohio State, got a degree in civil engineering. He is, by every external measure, fine. He has just never, in all the years since, lived on a ground floor. He tells himself it's a preference. And the kid alone in the Tennessee farmhouse, the one who heard something breathing in the trees, that kid grew up. That kid is telling you this story now. Here's what I've learned from years of carrying these experiences and talking to people who've had their own. Fear doesn't require an explanation to be real. It doesn't require a resolution. It doesn't need you to know what caused it in order to have changed something in you. The most honest thing I can say about all 5 of these stories, including my own, is that the people who experience them are not the same people they were before. Not dramatically different, not broken, just permanently adjusted, like a compass that's been held too close to a magnet. It still works. It just points somewhere slightly different than it used to. If you've had an experience like these, if there's something you know happened to you that you can't explain, that you've maybe never told anyone because you're not sure how to describe it without sounding like you're losing your mind, I want you to know something. You're not losing your mind. Some things don't have explanations. Some things are just what they are. And some doors, once you've stood on the wrong side of them, stay with you forever. A note on these accounts. The stories collected here were submitted by real people, Americans from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, different ages. None of them knew each other. None of them were asked to exaggerate or embellish. What you read is what they described, as accurately and as completely as they could manage. Some of them have spoken about these experiences publicly before. Some of them submitted accounts they've never told anyone. All of them, when asked if they wished it hadn't happened to them, gave the same basic answer. They didn't know. Not, "No, I'm glad it happened." Not, "Yes, I wish I could erase it." Just, they didn't know. There's something about a genuine encounter with the inexplicable, whether supernatural or simply terrifying in the most ordinary human sense, that changes your relationship with certainty. You stop being sure about things you used to be sure about. You start paying attention to things you used to ignore. Whether that's a gift or a curse probably depends on what you encounter. Sleep well. What happened in the years after years pass? Memories don't. The youngest sibling from Eldridge Lane, the one who followed Connor into the abandoned house at age 10, grew up to become a teacher in the same Dayton suburb where the story began. She still drives past the end of Eldridge Lane sometimes. The house is gone now, demolished sometime in the early 2000s to make room for a parking structure that has never, as far as she knows, been reported haunted. But the lot where it stood is always colder than the surrounding block. She's told herself this is her imagination. She's probably right. Connor became an electrician. He doesn't believe in ghosts. He said this at family gatherings more times than can be counted. He says it with the flat certainty of someone who has decided a thing is true and will not be receiving new information on the subject. His younger sibling has learned not to argue. But she's noticed that he keeps a flashlight on his nightstand. Not a phone flashlight, not a lamp. A real flashlight, charged and ready. She's never asked him why. He would say it's practical. She believes him, mostly. The Hargrove University women's restroom on the third floor of Whitfield Hall was renovated in 2019 as part of a broader campus accessibility initiative. New stalls, new fixtures, new tile. The renovation crew reportedly worked quickly and didn't ask many questions about the building. One of the contractors mentioned afterward to a university staff member that his crew had felt uncomfortable in that particular room for reasons they couldn't articulate. The staff member noted this in an email that was forwarded to the facilities office and then apparently never addressed. As of this writing, the bathroom is back in regular use. The third stall is still the third stall. Danny, who is now a graphic designer living in Portland, Oregon, has been back to Hargrove once for a 10-year reunion. She walked past Whitfield Hall but didn't go in. When someone in her reunion group suggested stopping in to see the old classrooms, she said she had somewhere to be. She didn't have somewhere to be. The missionary from Osaka, he goes by his middle name now, has for years, not because of anything that happened in Japan, just preference. Keeps in touch with Bradshaw through occasional texts and an annual phone call around the holidays. They have never returned to Japan. Bradshaw went into finance. The missionary went into nonprofit work. They both have kids. They're both, by all appearances, fine. At Bradshaw's wedding reception during the open dancing portion of the night, his new wife's grandfather, a small, cheerful man from Kyoto who had moved to the United States decades prior, struck up a conversation with the missionary. They talked for a while about the city, about the changes over the years, about the parts of Osaka that tourists typically miss. And then the grandfather, in the gentle, conversational way of someone making small talk, mentioned that the neighborhood where they'd been stationed for their last assignment had a rough reputation. The missionary asked what he meant. The grandfather just shook his head and changed the subject. The missionary didn't press. He hasn't told this detail to many people. He's not sure why. The teenager from suburban Columbus, the one who called his dad from under his bed, while something knocked patiently on his living room window, is 31 years old now and works as a civil engineer in Cincinnati. He is rational and methodical by both profession and temperament. He believes in structural analysis. He believes in load-bearing calculations and soil composition reports, and the measured, evidence-based assessment of physical reality. He does not believe in ghosts. He also does not live on a ground floor. These two facts coexist in him without apparent tension. He doesn't examine them too closely. Some things you just carry. The rider from the Tennessee farmhouse, the one who heard the sound from the tree line, has thought for years about going back to that farmhouse. His parents sold it when he was in college, and the property has changed hands twice since. He's looked it up online. The aerial photos show the same yard, the same tree line, the same tire swing. Gone now, but the branch it hung from is still visible in the satellite image, a thick horizontal limb extending from the oak tree like an arm reaching out. He's thought about going back. He hasn't. Some doors, once you've been on the wrong side of them, stay with you. On the nature of darkness. There are people who study these things. Researchers, investigators, academics with legitimate credentials who spend their professional lives trying to understand the borderline experiences that human beings have been reporting since the beginning of recorded history. The ones who've read the literature, reviewed the data, and spent real time in the field tend to say one consistent thing. The most common element in genuine anomalous experiences is not spectacle. It's not drama. It's not the full Hollywood presentation of levitating objects and blood-dripping walls. The most common element is this: a quality of attention, an awareness that something is paying attention to you. Every one of the accounts in this collection contains that element. The brother who stopped cranking his flashlight because he felt, not heard, felt, something listening in the dark above them. The college student who stood outside a locked stall and experienced the specific, uncategorizable sensation of being observed from within. The missionary who sat across a table and watched a man's face and understood with perfect clarity that the moment of recognition had not yet arrived, but was approaching. The teenager who saw not a figure, but a shadow. The residue of presence rather than presence itself. The kid from Tennessee who stood in the dark and felt the tree line looking back. Attention. Awareness. The sense that something knows where you are. You can explain most of these accounts with enough effort. Old houses have sound conduction properties that create audio illusions. College campuses have histories that get turned into mythology. Drunk people in dangerous situations are dangerous for ordinary reasons. Teenagers alone in empty houses are subject to suggestion and anxiety. Sounds in rural environments at night are almost always animals. Almost always. The explanations work most of the time. They work well enough, most of the time, that you can hold them up in front of the experience and use them as a shield. But late at night, in the quiet, after the house is settled, in the specific kind of silence that exists at 2 in the morning when everything else has gone still, do the explanations still work? That's the question. That's always the question.